Arthur, in trying to understand the nature of reality and studying religions, eschatology, the study of end times, is very important in Christianity. And I've looked at that quite extensively. But in my own tradition, in Judaism, I'm actually less knowledgeable. So I come to you, an expert in Jewish eschatology, to understand what it's all about.
Well, let me begin by saying that eschatology as a formal discipline came rather late in Jewish tradition and in Jewish life. In the Bible itself, there's almost no mention of eschatology until very late, the book of Daniel.
Yes.
And we know that it was still very much debated in the first century of the Common Era. For example, Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that there was a controversy between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, that the Sadducees did not believe in the afterlife because the Bible did not explain it explicitly.
Yes.
The Pharisees, on the other hand, were very much in favor of the afterlife and developed doctrines of the afterlife from earlier materials.
So how then did the concept of eschatology develop? Are there categories? How do we understand eschatology?
Well, on the Jewish end, there are three aspects of eschatology. The first one of these is the notion of the Messiah,
Yes.
and this goes back to the Davidic dynasty. The second one is the resurrection of the dead, in which Jewish tradition, at least classical Jewish tradition, believed quite literally. And the third concept is that of the world to come, which came after the resurrection of the dead.
So these are the three categories: the Messiah and the Messianic times, the resurrection of the dead, and the world to come. These are three separate categories in which we can understand Jewish eschatology.
These are three separate categories, but they're often conceived in a sequential way.
Yes.
That the Messiah would come first,
Yes.
either during the time of the Messiah or afterwards. There would be resurrection of the dead, and the final stage would be the world to come. And there were different interpretations as Jewish tradition went on of these concepts.
Now, in many religions, certainly most aspects of Christianity and other world religions, the afterlife is something that occurs immediately after we're dead. And yet that's different than the resurrection of the dead, which won't happen until this sequence of events occurs. So how does Judaism deal with the immediacy of the afterlife in its eschatology of the individual?
There is not too much discussion of what happens immediately after death. And sort of the more important doctrine, in my view, is that of the resurrection of the dead.
Yes.
There's much more discussion of how this would happen, and there are different versions of it in the rabbinic tradition and in the philosophic tradition afterwards.
So in Judaism, we really have these periods in a chronology: the original Bible, and maybe in the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, and then the prophets, and then later prophets like Daniel, as you were saying. Then we have the post-biblical time, the so-called apocalyptic literature, then the rabbinic traditions in Jerusalem and Babylonia, and the Middle Ages, medieval philosophy, modern. There's a long history. How has this developed?
Well, in the Bible itself, I think the most interesting case is the case of Saul, the king of the Jews.
Yes.
Because he prohibited speculations about the afterlife. There apparently was a kind of a reaction to it. And then the Bible tells us, at least the book of Kings, that Saul was in trouble. There had been a prediction that the kingship would be taken away from him. So he went to a person who was still trained in bringing up the dead, and he asked her to bring the shade of Samuel, and he brings Samuel up up from the dead.
Yeah.
And Samuel gets very upset, and he says, "Why do you bring me up from the dead? Wasn't it you who prohibited this activity?" And then he finally tells him that what I've told you before, the kingdom will be taken away from you. Now, what we can learn from that story is that an early eschatological doctrine was that person after death went to a place called Sheol, which was a kind of a subterranean space, that they lived there in some forms, kind of shades, and that, at least according to this story, could be brought up. Now, this type of theme does not appear in later kinds of Jewish thought or Jewish theology, and eschatology becomes more formal and sort of becomes, if you want to put it in that way, more spiritual.
And if we look at some of the most distinguished Jewish philosophers, so like Maimonides in the medieval times, what did he teach? How did he synthesize these different traditions?
Well, Maimonides is rather unusual because, first of all, he was a very independent kind of person. On the legal end, he put together his Mishneh Torah, the repetition of the law, which had no less a purpose than to codify all of Jewish law, which in fact he did. Yeah. Now, his approach to Judaism was much more philosophical than, let's say, the rabbis or later person. Yeah. And he speaks about the Messiah, but important points of his eschatology are the resurrection of the dead and the life to come, in Hebrew called Olam Haba, the world to come. Now, the major doctrine in his philosophy was Olam Haba, the world to come, which he gave a very philosophic interpretation, a non-physical one, that what would remain after death ultimately would be a disembodied intellect that had understood certain things. So the problem that he had was to fit the resurrection of the dead into the scheme.
So he had, in essence, a disembodied intellect, which sounds somewhat similar to the Christian immortality of the soul in terms of this disembodied personality.
Well, I think it was not so much a reflection of anything Christian, but rather a philosophic idea that he tried to build philosophic ideas into the Jewish tradition.
Or maybe it's better to say that both the Christian tradition and maybe that part of the Jewish tradition both had their same origin in Greek philosophy and the Platonic ideas.
No, that's very much the case. That I think in the case of Maimonides, it came largely out of the Aristotelian tradition. Mm-hmm. So what we see then in eschatological doctrines is a development from a very physical kind of conception, in the case of Saul and Samuel that I've mentioned, to the case of Maimonides, to a very philosophic and spiritual reflection, which has, of course, a great affinity to the thought of Aristotle and to some extent the thought of Plato. So you find this kind of development in eschatological doctrines, which to my mind is very important and very interesting, because what we see here is that eschatological ideas in the Jewish tradition, as I presume in most religious traditions, did not remain static. That is, they developed in accordance with different types of cultural settings, and Maimonides represents one aspect of this in the medieval tradition.